Welcome as we go exploring the world of Pokemon. As today's story will focus on a very interesting Pokemon, as we have from death to discovery. And today's story will start on a very interesting place, however, with the most unassuming of Pokemon, as we have Basculin. As many people know, Basculin are not particularly the most powerful Pokemon around the world, as many are actually viewed as somewhat of a nuisance in some regions. However, some view it as a very good sport catching Pokemon, and some trainers even use them on their teams as they have a certain tenacity to them. And for the most part, they are associated simply with the Unova region, as that's where they are originated from, and they actually have the most dominant form here in terms of the aquatic life, as Basculin seem to appear in almost all the waterways of Unova. However, there's something interesting about the Basculin species that we did not know of, and we would find out in a very interesting way, as a scientist somewhere, unfortunately has not been fully identified, found a ledger as this old book, so to seem, was filled with entries from Pokemon from days gone by, as it would fill out the past and allow us to understand something that was very interesting, as there was many Pokemon that had been lost to science, or so we thought. In this case, this old ledger book dated back somewhat a couple hundred years at least. However, most of it remained intact, and some of these things had very interesting things, as we'll focus on some of the Pokemon that came out of this ledger today, as one of them would be very strange, as to many of the professors that would see it and the different scientists that looked in, one of these images was very obvious. It was a Pokemon that had been seen before, as this was clearly a Basculin, but it wasn't unlike anything we had ever seen, and underneath it, and its entries, were two more Pokemon. However, they were unsure of what these were, as there was never been any knowledge about what it was. And as you can assume, the Pokemon scientific community was in an uproar, as many asked, what is it? As we were to look more on the morphological sense of the depictions in this primitive Pokedex, so to speak, we would see some very interesting things, as this was indeed, at least from what we would understand, a new form of a Basculin, or at least a Basculin that had never been seen before, as some of its parts obviously seemed to be amalgamated from the red and blue striped Basculin. But what was the most striking feature on this particular Pokemon was the white stripes that ran along its head, and the color of its eyes to match that stripe, as this had never been seen before. And the even bigger question were, what were the two Pokemon that happened to be found underneath it? As many were speculating on what this could be, some believing that maybe this was some type of evolution caused by maybe an item, something like the Clamperl line in Hoenn, and others believed that maybe this was a separate Pokemon altogether that had nothing to do with the Basculin. However, the similarities between both and the relative focus of both being underneath one another in this Pokedex led many to believe that this might be some type of evolution. However, the striking resemblances and differences between both of these forms was also a mystery. However, there would be a breakthrough, as where this ledger was found was in the Sinnoh region, and the professor that found it said that this book dated back far into their past, and it would be introduced that this Pokedex must have dated from the ancient Hisui region, which, although ancient is a relative term for a couple hundred years ago, Sinnoh at that time was a very, very different place, and we would begin to see the windows into the past and also be able to understand what we were seeing. As unfortunately, all that was left in the book from the name of the professor was somewhat scratched out, as we had Professor Lav. However, as Professor Lav would be eventually, and hopefully will be found out who the name is, we can only speculate to what their ancestry was, because if we could find the family, we could probably find some of the ancient past, but it's okay, as we have some of the entries left with these Pokemon, as we actually have for this Basculin a entry of itself, and it reads as follows. Though it differs from other Basculin in several respects, including demeanor, this one is gentle. I have categorized it as a regional form, given the vast array of shared qualities. This was an amazing statement, as whoever this professor was knew that this basculin in particular that was found in Hisui must have been its own regional form, not seen anywhere else, as blue and red striped basculin have actually been a very common occurrence around the Pokemon world even a couple hundred years ago. It made sense that this was the right call. And we would begin to learn as there were some more entries about the basculin and how they lived their lives, as it was believed that the white striped basculin enjoyed living in Hisui's waters, and they developed their specific way of locomotion and ability to live and to deal with the hardiness and dangers of the region, as Hisui was known as a region of very, very tough environment. So the Pokemon there were also very tough as well. It was once believed by those of the indigenous people of the region at the time that this Pokemon, in particular Basculin, would evolve through collecting the souls of dead Basculin, as this would allow them to effectively, congregate inside the body of one and begin to form an amalgamation, as it allowed them to evolve into their more powerful forms. The forms that we were wondering about would have a name, as they were the evolution considered and called Basculegion, as Basculegion would come in two forms, and it is even depicted of this strange evolution phenomenon and theory that they believed, which is in its decades entry, which states as follows. It clads itself in the souls of comrades that perished before fulfilling their goals of journeying upstream. No other species throughout all of Hisui's rivers is Basculegion's equal. From this entry alone, we must have believed that the locals, or the actual people of the time, must have seen Basculegions swim up rivers and go through this situation as basculins to maybe do some type of evolution. As we do know that there was populations at the time in the region, this means that they must have spawned and lived somewhere in the region and reproduced in a similar sense. And it seemed they had an affinity for the colder areas of the region, as it would seem that in places such as the Obsidian Fieldlands, which is marked in the Pokedex at the time, that these Pokemon are absent from that area, meaning that they did exist in Hisui, but not all over. And as we could see in places such as the Alabaster Icelands, that the Basculin, the White Stripe in particular, thrived in this area. However, after all this information was found out, it still left many questions. But the first question that was coming through most of the professors' minds is what could have led to the absence of this Pokemon in the modern day? As we wondered what could have started the decline. As it was a mystery for many scientists all over the world how Basculegion and Basculin as a whole went extinct, as they had to find a way to explain where it had went, as Hisui, although changing to Sinnoh, has carried a lot of Pokemon. However, from this Pokedex, we learned that many have actually disappeared from the region. However, we'll start with some of the likely reasons to explain why Basculegion may have gone extinct, as one of the first ones that was projected was competition. As although there was mentioned in the Pokedex that Basculegion possessed no equal, it did share its environment with a super predator as well, one that's very well known throughout the Pokemon world, and that is Gyarados. Although Gyarados is prominent in almost every single region, Unova is one of the few regions where it wasn't very prevalent. And in this case, in modern-day Sinnoh, Gyarados can be found in almost every available water source via Magikarp. So this at least gave us and scientists some explanation as to where they could have gone, as being outcompeted was possibly a way to view this, as it would be believed that in a single battle, a Gyarados could stand no match to a Basculegion, as Basculegions are very powerful. However, this was actually chosen as maybe a counter argument, as we do know how the Gyarados live, as they actually live as social predators, and they usually tend to live in groups. As yes, you can find solo Gyarados, but many tend to stick together, as a group is usually more effective, as 3 Gyaradoses may have been more of a match to 1 Basculegion. However, although this theory made sense, due to some of the explanations of locals at the time through their stories and their data entries, as well as the Pokedex, this didn't seem to be a very good case, as we do know that Basculegion and Gyarados were able to live somewhat peacefully and relatively peacefully in the same environment, as they technically didn't really compete with one another at all. They would even share some of the same territories at times, and were not necessarily prone to fighting with one another. So if competition wasn't it, what was the other option? As we went back to the drawing board to discover what could possibly have been this Pokemon's declining reason, and there was one that could have also been an issue. This was the arrival of more people into the region, as although at the time there were people who had lived in Hisui, there wasn't as many people living there at the time, as most of the region was unpopulated. Only really small villages existing in about 3 parts of the region, and some other people living out in the Badlands, as most of the region remained untamed and wild. However, this would change with more people. However, this also was not necessarily a good case of explanation, as when we would find out from some of the datings of the time of this Pokedex's recording, people of the region revere their Pokemon. Many of the people who were indigenous to the region actually held them in high esteem, especially those of the aforementioned Diamond Clan, as it was made clear that they actually effectively worshipped and took care of Basculegion. Even one of their apparent wardens would take care of them as noble Pokemon. And it was even categorized in the book that people would ride Basculegion, utilizing it as almost a form of locomotion and travel around this region. So that also kind of dispelled the issue of people just getting rid of them via maybe hunting or even destroying their habitats, as it seemed this Pokemon was rather revered. So, what then? As many scientists scratched their heads, as it seemed that for once, a Pokemon going completely extinct out of nowhere just doesn't make sense, and they don't just vanish overnight. So we had to figure out what had happened, as a theory was put forth that it was actually a culmination of all of these issues, and then one on top that couldn't actually have been dealt with by any region, as unfortunately it was just a passage of time. As the expansion of people did necessarily hurt the Sinnoh or the Hisui region, as with the minor villages that had existed before, that was fine. However, as cities began to spring up, we can even see this with something like Jubilife Village, that became Jubilife City, and is home to many, many, many thousands to almost millions of people at this point in the Sinnoh region, as sources were obviously extracted. As the rest of Sinnoh became developed, a lot of the areas that Basculegion and Basculin called home would eventually be turned into areas for people to live. As well as another theory that was proposed to coincide with this was, although Basculegion did not compete with Gyarados, this didn't mean that Basculin didn't have competition from another Pokemon, that being Magikarp. As although Basculin and Magikarp don't necessarily seem to be at odds with one another, being outcompeted was obviously something that was seen, as Magikarp are very hardy and can exist in almost every climate if given the chance. Although never necessarily as Gyarados, Magikarp can easily outcompete Basculin, as Basculin seem to tend to like the colder waters. However, this doesn't mean that Magikarp doesn't like the colder waters. It just means that there's no Gyaradoses really. And unfortunately for the lesser forms, just because they're not evolved does not mean that they can't still have a purpose. And Magikarp outcompeting Basculin was definitely something that was possible. However, the final nail in the coffin was actually proposed after looking at the map of Hisui, as unfortunately for Basculin and Basculegion, the climate was changing. As we could tell by the map, a lot of Hisui's geographic diversity, especially the Alabaster Icelands, was very, very cold. And lots of ice formed at the northern region of the Sinnoh region. Unfortunately, now today, most of the ice and snow is basically kept to Snow Point Mountain, and where Snow Point City would be located, we have those similar factors. However, for Basculin and Basculegion, this means that the territory was going to get smaller and smaller, as it seems that they tended to enjoy the colder waters. It was very clear that they were losing more of their territory as it would get warmer and warmer, and Basculin and Basculegion became a sight that was hard to see. As unfortunately, as the 3 elements that came to be, whether it's expansion, outperformance, or even the global warming that was taking place, the idea was prophesized and put forward, as many believe that this must have been the combination of issues that dealt with Basculin and Basculegion and unfortunately made them extinct in Hisui. As unfortunately, after a certain time, there was a few entries in journals that said that this Pokemon could not be found, and almost as if a haunting spirit was in the water, that was the only way to know if Basculin and Basculegion still exist, as their spirits would go through the remaining waters where they used to live, and that would be the only thing that the people of Sinnoh and Hisui as a whole would remember of the ancient past, as Basculin and Basculegion were lost. However, this didn't mean that it was the end for the search of these Pokemon, as unfortunately, but fortunately for many professors, a wanted poster was made for anyone around the Pokemon world to see if they could find Basculin or Basculegion, as many professors decided to search, as maybe this Pokemon hadn't fully disappeared, and maybe it was just absent for this time. And with the beliefs of many, and unfortunately for those who had done the initial investigation, it would go dead and silent for some time. Hey you! Yeah, you, I can see you. If you're watching this video, I think you should subscribe, as this video focuses on informing you. This channel does just that, and informs you. We'd appreciate it very much, and if you want to see content like this, don't give up and subscribe. Don't forget that notification bell, as this is what helps us keep making content for you. And as we return to your regularly scheduled program. As many professors began to give up, they believed that Basculin and Basculegion, or at least the white stripe form, were completely gone, and there would be no more for the future, as many wanted to close the book on trying to find them, as many hadn't been seen even after a couple of years had passed with the wanted posters up. However, this wouldn't be the case forever, as all of a sudden, from a place that's almost unknown to many people at the time, something was heard, as a message would come out from a far-off region that's so small people miss it by just dodging it on the map. As this was the region of Kitakami. As many people actually have never been to Kitakami in terms of scientists, the region had been left somewhat untamed, as we look at the region itself, it's an island, which usually tends to have very strange Pokemon as they evolve to meet the different climates and different situations, as although it's pretty big, it's not huge enough to be any footnote compared to other regions, but there was something interesting, as a professor that was touring the area at the time had finally been let in, as unfortunately for a while, people of Kitakami did not like outsiders, but as they began to open up to the world and let people come and visit and join, one of these professors actually asked if any of the locals would like to see a book, and after they looked through the book, they asked if any of the Pokemon that had been seen could be identified in this region. However, many actually scratched their head, saying that they couldn't see anything like it. However, a fisherman said that they had seen something that looked just like this, as they actually pointed out to the white striped basculin, as they said that they actually might know where those are. And this shocked the professor, saying, "Are you sure?" Because basculin have usually been found in other regions. Usually this discovery leads to the finding of red or blue striped basculin. But this local seemed very sure that they had seen these, so they were led. As fortunately, they were led to the mouth of an ocean towards the front or the northern part of the region. And they were surprised, as the mouth of the ocean straggled up a small clustered stream towards the mountain face. They were going to see a miraculous discovery, as it led to a pool at the base of the mountain. And this pool in the base of the mountain was teeming with basculin. And the professor was shocked, as they wanted to make sure, and after pulling one out of the water, they were sure this was white striped basculin. Nothing could be debated, as it had the characteristic stripe, the characteristic looks, and possessed all of the different personality of basculin, as white striped basculin tend to be very gentle, and this one didn't mind being pulled out of the water, although it didn't like the fact that it had to be out of the water for some period of time, as it was captured promptly by that professor as a specimen. However, it was also explained by the same fisherman that if the professor wanted to meet the other Pokemon in the picture, as he pointed to both of the Basculegion forms, it was made clear that they could be interacted with through the use of the Terra Raid phenomenon that does take place on Kitakami, which is also another discovery, but for another time. As the Terra Raid dens that could be interacted with by those who lived on the island itself would run into these Pokemon in the middle of a den and would actually be terrified, as Basculegions are fierce fighters, and it very much did terrify the people of Kitakami. But however, for the Pokemon scientific world, this was a massive breakthrough, as both of these Pokemon had been rediscovered. And thanks to the studies done on Kitakami, it was made clear as to what happened exactly to white-striped basculin, as it was believed that although they went extinct in the Hisui region at the time, this didn't mean that the population was limited to just the Hisui region, as unfortunately for most, they did not know, the basculin that like to live out in the waters, they did live in the ocean, and this did mean that they could travel, that and Basculegion could too. As many began to search the northern region of the Pokemon world, they began to find out that this doesn't actually mean that they were gone. In fact, this means that they had spread out even further. As towards it gets colder in the north, they began to find more basculin and Basculegion, heading mostly in the northern oceans away from land, as most of them tend to spend their time there and come to shore only to mate, reproduce, and drop their eggs, as the colder lands happen to hold more of this special area, but also showed that they knew maybe exactly what would happen as the basculin began to leave Kitakami, as the temperature began to incline and maybe the competition became too fierce. They went out to the open oceans as they began to search the Pokemon world and head north, as this was actually the perfect environment for all of these Pokemon, whether both forms of Basculegion, which would finally be confirmed to be male and female as their split evolutions, but also for the basculin that tended to like the colder waters. They could find a place to live of their own that was unimpeded by humans, but also unimpeded by the warmth, as basculin and Basculegion were finally refound, as although it's much more easier to find them in Kitakami, this meant that they still existed in the Pokemon world, but were also difficult to see. And even to this day, professors struggle to find them, as unfortunately they do live out in the open ocean, and following a Pokemon, especially a fish Pokemon, far out to the open ocean, especially in the cold, is not easy. But this also did help us ecologically, as for once, as humans in the Pokemon world, we finally found out that maybe our impacts don't lead to the end of our Pokemon, as these Pokemon who did go extinct, at least in Hisui, didn't begin to live on, and the world is much more fortunate, as trainers actually really enjoy the use of Basculin and Basculegion in competitive battles, as these Pokemon are fierce fighters, and many actually enjoy them as pets, as their gentle demeanor means they can be kept and played with and enjoyed. And even with the scary forms of Basculegion, it's made clear that they are still very much interesting. And the land of Kitakami itself would hold more secrets for many professors, as it was believed that even more Pokemon that had disappeared from Hisui could possibly be found on the island. However, this is where this documentary ends for today, and this story concludes, as we found Basculegion once again, as From Death to Discovery spells out, we don't always leave what we end up losing, but we can find our way back to it. As always, guys, this is Brad from the Ad Army signing off. And for all of you out there, to sign on.